Macmillan Audio presents The Dry by Jane Harper. Read for you by Shanahan.
Prologue. It wasn't as though the farm hadn't seen death before, and the blowflies didn't discriminate. To them there was little difference between a carcass and a corpse. The drought had left the flies spoiled for choice that summer. They sought out unblinking eyes and sticky wounds as the farmers of Kiwara levelled their rifles at skinny livestock. No rain meant no feed, and no feed made for difficult decisions, as the tiny town shimmered under day after day of burning blue sky. "It'll break," the farmers said as the months ticked over into a second year. They repeated the words out loud to each other like a mantra, and under their breath to themselves like a prayer. But the weathermen in Melbourne disagreed. Besuited and sympathetic in air-conditioned studios, they made a passing reference most nights at 6. Officially, the worst conditions in a century. The weather pattern had a name, the pronunciation of which was never quite settled: El Niño. At least the blowflies were happy. The finds that day were unusual, though. Smaller and with a smoothness to the flesh. Not that it mattered. They were the same where it counted. The glassy eyes, the wet wounds. The body in the clearing was the freshest. It took the flies slightly longer to discover the two in the farmhouse, despite the front door swinging open like an invitation. Those that ventured beyond the initial offering in the hallway were rewarded with another, this time in the bedroom. This one was smaller, but less engulfed by competition. First on the scene, the flies swarmed contentedly in the heat as the blood pooled black over tiles and carpet. Outside, washing hung still on the rotary line, bone dry and stiff from the sun. A child's scooter lay abandoned on the stepping stone path. Just one human heart beat within a kilometre radius of the farm. So nothing reacted when deep inside the house, the baby started crying. Chapter 1. Even those who didn't darken the door of the church from one Christmas to the next could tell there would be more mourners than seats. A bottleneck of black and grey was already forming at the entrance as Aaron Falk drove up, trailing a cloud of dust and cracked leaves. Neighbours, determined but trying not to appear so, jostled each other for the advantage as the scrum trickled through the doors. Across the road, the media circled. Falk parked his sedan next to a ute that had also seen better days and killed the engine. The air conditioner rattled into silence and the interior began to warm immediately. He allowed himself a moment to scan the crowd, although he didn't really have time. He dragged his heels the whole way from Melbourne, blowing out the 5-hour drive to more than 6. Satisfied no one looked familiar, he stepped out of the car. The late afternoon heat draped itself around him like a blanket. He snatched open the backseat door to get his jacket, searing his hand in the process. After the briefest hesitation, he grabbed his hat from the seat. Wide-brimmed in stiff brown canvas, it didn't go with his funeral suit. But with skin the blue hue of skimmed milk for half the year and a cancerous-looking cluster of freckles the rest, Falk was prepared to risk the fashion faux pas. Pale from birth, with close-cropped white blonde hair and invisible eyelashes, he'd often felt during his 36 years that the Australian sun was trying to tell him something. It was a message easier to ignore in the tall shadows of Melbourne than in Kiwara, where shade was a fleeting commodity. Falk glanced once at the road leading back out of town, then at his watch. The funeral, the wake, one night, and he was gone. 18 hours, he calculated, no more. Keeping that firmly in mind, he loped towards the crowd, one hand on his hat as a sudden hot gust sent hems flying. Inside, the church was even smaller than he'd remembered. Shoulder to shoulder with strangers, Falk allowed himself to be ferried deeper into the congregation. He noticed a free spot along the wall and darted in, carving out a space next to a farmer whose cotton shirt strained taut across his belly. The man gave him a nod and went back to staring straight ahead. Falk could see creases at his elbows where the shirt sleeves had until recently been rolled up. Falk removed his hat and discreetly fanned himself. He couldn't help glancing around. Faces that at first had seemed unfamiliar came more sharply into focus, and he felt an illogical rush of surprise at some of the crow's feet, silver-streaked hair and gained kilos sprinkled throughout the crowd. An older man 2 rows back caught Falk's eye with a nod, and they exchanged a sad smile of recognition. What was his name? Falk tried to remember. He couldn't focus. The man had been a teacher. Falk could just about picture him at the front of a classroom, gamely attempting to bring geography or woodwork or something else alive for bored teenagers, but the memory kept flitting away. The man nodded at the bench beside him, indicating he would make space, but Falk shook his head politely and turned back to the front. He avoided small talk at the best of times, and this, unquestionably, was a million horrific miles from the best of times. God, that middle coffin was small. Lying between the 2 full-size ones only made it look worse, if that were possible. Tiny kids with combed hair plastered to their skulls pointed it out. Dad, look, that box is in football colours. Those old enough to know what was inside stared in appalled silence, fidgeting in their school uniforms as they edged a little closer to their mothers. Above the 3 coffins, a family of 4 stared down from a blown-up photograph. Their static smiles were overlarge and pixelated. Falk recognised the picture from the news. It had been used a lot. Beneath, the names of the dead were spelled out in native flowers. Luke, Karen, Billy. Falk stared at Luke's picture. The thick black hair had the odd grey line now, but he still looked fitter than most men on the wrong side of 35. His face seemed older than Falk remembered, but then it had been nearly 5 years. The confident grin was unchanged, as was the slightly knowing look in his eyes. Still the same were the words that sprang to mind. 3 coffins said differently. Bloody tragic. The farmer at Falk's side spoke out of nowhere. His arms were crossed, fist wedged tightly under his armpits. It is, Falk said. You knew him well? Not really. Only Luke For a dizzy moment, Falk couldn't think of a word to describe the man in the largest coffin. He mentally grasped about, but could only find cliched tabloid descriptions. The father, he landed on finally. We were friends when we were younger. Yeah, I know who Luke Hadler is. I think everyone does now. Still live around this way, do you? The farmer shifted his large body slightly and fixed Falk properly in his gaze for the first time. No, not for a long time. Right. Feels like I've seen you, though. The farmer frowned, trying to place him. Hey, you're not one of them bloody TV journos, are you? No, police, in Melbourne. That right? You lot should be investigating the bloody government for letting things get this bad. The man nodded to where Luke's body lay alongside those of his wife and 6-year-old son. We're out here trying to feed this country, worst weather in 100 years, and they're crapping on about scrapping the subsidies? In some ways you can hardly blame the poor bastard. He stopped, looked around the church. It's an effing scandal, that's what it is. Falk said nothing as they both reflected on the incompetencies of Canberra. The potential sources of blame for the dead Hadler family had been thrashed out at length over newspaper pages. You looking into this then? The man nodded his head towards the coffins. No, just here as a friend, Falk said. I'm not sure there's anything still to look into. He knew only what he'd heard on the news along with everyone else, but it was straightforward according to the commentary. The shotgun had belonged to Luke. It was the same one later found clamped into what had been left of his mouth. No, I suppose not, the farmer said. I just thought with him being your friend and all. I'm not that kind of officer anyway. Federal, with the Financial Intelligence Unit. It means nothing to me, mate. Just means I chase the money. Anything ending with a few zeros, that's not where it should be. Laundered, embezzled, that sort of thing.